Hello, thanks for attending. Welcome to today's class from FileMaker Academy. The title of today's class is Improving FileMaker Custom App Performance. I'll be your presenter and instructor today. My name is Mark Richmond. Let's go through a quick series of slides and we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation today. My hope is to get things done pretty quickly so that I can leave plenty of time at the end for questions. I don't have any slides to show you about using the Gotowebinar control panel. I apologize, that's something I'm making a note of for future reference for our slides. But there is in the web control panel a couple options. You can raise your hand and ask a question. You can also use the chat feature to send the chat directly to me. I'll do my best at the end of the process to look through those and pick out some questions to answer. So I will not be using the audio to do that, just to keep things less complicated. And since I don't have another organizer with me, I'm not entirely certain that I'd be able to do so quickly and alone. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, who is FileMaker Academy? Well, FileMaker Academy is a series of FileMaker Business Alliance Platinum member companies spread across the United States who work together in collaboration to provide this educational content. Basically, we take turns providing information about the FileMaker platform or integration or mobility or sync or specific and useful FileMaker products or add-ons in an effort to raise general awareness of the platform, how it's licensed, how it's used, and as well as how to make solutions perform well or work well for users. We continue to have events every month, and certainly if you go to the FileMakerAcademy.com website, you can keep appraised of those. At the end of the presentation today, we'll have a slide which contains all of our contact information as well. So who am I really quickly in the sense of keeping things simple for you guys? Hold on a second here. I'm the co-founder and president of Skeleton Key. We're a FileMaker Business Alliance Platinum member company. Myself, I've been using FileMaker for a little over 26 years, creating FileMaker solutions, designing and architecting them. I've offered several white papers, many of which are about design and performance, which is why I'm talking today to you about performance. I frequently speak at the annual FileMaker Developer Conference, which is also known as DevCon. In fact, I can see a number of attendees here, people who've been to this conference with me in the past. I'm the co-founder and president also of a sister company called BrightSource IT, and that's because I have over 30 years of experience in IT and intra-networking infrastructure, which means basically I used to be a network engineer, did a lot of Cisco work, and became very familiar with the underlying underpinnings of the internet and the networks that we all rely on in our offices and watch them evolve from hubs to switches and all the different kinds of complex technologies we have. As a result, when it came to the topic of performance, as this first came onto the horizon, as we'll discuss in 2009 and 2010, it immediately spoke to me and became a topic of great interest. The fact that FileMaker is willing to share so much with us about how FileMaker operates under the hood made me want to explain it to other people, and so that's why we're here today. But today we're going to talk specifically about how to improve FileMaker custom app performance. And some of this material is going to be familiar to those of you who've seen me talk about this topic or read these white papers, so I'll apologize in advance. My hope today is to give a quick overview of some of that material and then to dive into a couple of very specific things I'd recommend you start with. Hopefully the majority of the people attending today are new to this topic, and so I'll be pointing you to a lot of resources with lots of great reading and other information, and then also giving you some practical takeaways as well. And for the very technical of you at the end, I'll point you to two options that you can dig into further if you want to do your own testing and performance tuning. But my goal is to kind of cover a broad variety of information today. So let's go ahead and dive in. So here's my agenda. Basically, we've got a problem, and that is performance. And so we're going to be clear about why we have that problem. And then I'm going to offer a simple 4-step solution and walk you through those steps. Part of that's going to be talking about performance improvements that are built into the platform, some of which are new and some of which have been there all along. I'm going to point you to a whole bunch of optimization resources out there. Like I said, white papers and previous sessions and other kinds of material that can really give you a lot more detail than I can stuff into an hour. And I'll make sure that I make both the recording as well as this slide deck available, either as a PDF or as a PowerPoint or Keynote or all of the above, so that it's easier for you to get to those links that you'll see in kind of plain text, but I'll make sure you can get to the URLs as well when we're done. And then I'm going to point out 4 practical examples. If you had to pick from the entire legion of options for tuning and optimizing your solution, if it was me, I'd start with these 4. And so I'm going to point you to those 4, explain why I think that they're the best bang for your buck and the easiest to accommodate. And then we'll talk about a couple of advanced techniques or tools that you could use if you want to go a little deeper. And then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And if necessary, a little show and tell, especially around those practical examples. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is the problem? Well, the problem isn't a FileMaker problem. I want to be clear about this. The problem is that every software platform requires optimization. And this isn't something new. I think even if you take away software and think about architecture or think about car design or think about really anything, maybe just the way you organize your home or your kitchen, you're going to realize that reconciling form and function is an everything kind of topic. And by that, I mean that, sometimes we want things to operate and behave a certain way, and other times we want them to look a certain way, and the experience of using them to feel a certain way. And reconciling these two things can often lead to problems and difficulties and choices and priorities that have to be made. And I really think that's at the root of what's going on here. This isn't a FileMaker problem. This is a problem that exists in a number of different domains. They all have constraints. They all have limits. We all have sort of an agenda of things we'd like to get done. And then we have to find a way to strike the balance between what that user's experience or the form is and what the actual tool does, what the function is. And the reason I also know that this is common in software platforms in particular, and not just for FileMaker, is that every development conference has common session themes. If you go out right now and do a search for a variety of other platforms, and I don't even need to name them, you all know them, you're going to find that those annual conferences, a lot of them happen in the summer in various exotic locations. They have user experience or UX sessions. They have user interface and UI sessions. They've got sessions on mobility, and they've got sessions on performance and optimization. And almost without fail, regardless of how mature or how new a particular platform is, or how large or small or a boutique the development community that uses it is, has the same challenges. They're struggling with the same needs. And whether that's on your first new simple solution that you deploy to mobility or to users in the WAN, or whether you're hosting your first solution up in Amazon Web Services, or whether you're just trying to build a solution with a large amount of data to be used in a local office, at some point you're going to hit some kind of performance threshold where someone is going to turn to you as the developer or the architect and say this isn't performing well. And it really doesn't matter what platform you're using, you all run into these same kinds of problems. And so I think the problem and the solution is probably very similar and platform agnostic, even though today we're going to dive into FileMaker more specifically. And I want to be clear about why I think this is true. And some of you have already seen this slide in some of my recent presentations, but I really think it encapsulates the reason that this is a struggle, I think, for developers to adopt. First of all, FileMaker's made it really easy for us to develop solutions quickly. And for many of us, we've been developing them a long time, or we kind of got into it informally without any formal training. And so we just kind of dove in and started doing it. As a result, we didn't really think about the performance. We thought about the function and maybe the form, just from a usability standpoint. We were like, well, we need to store this kind of data here. We need to store that kind of data here. And I'd like to present it to my users this way so it's logical. And it was only after the solution was adopted that we discovered that we had bottlenecks, or that we had unacceptable performance parameters, that users were saying this report takes too long. It was great when we only had a couple hundred or a couple thousand records, but now that we've got a couple million records or hundreds of thousands of records, it's taking minutes as opposed to seconds to get the answers I need. This software is worthless. And it's really not that the software or the solution you've built is worthless, or that their requirements about storing that much data are out of scope of what's possible. It's just that that wasn't your concern when you were doing things up front. So I think what it comes down to is that on the one hand, we think of software like FileMaker as a database. It's a place to store information, usually in some kind of structured way, where there's some kind of natural way that stuff is linked together, a hierarchy or relationship of some kind. And we navigate through that in a way that to us makes sense from just a, everything in its place, a place for everything kind of mentality. On the other hand, we've got this concept of getting tasks done, facilitating workflow or processes and standardizing things and organizing them and giving us a way to kind of, shape the experience of how we consume that information, or how we create that information, or how we evolve that data over time. Perhaps a project gets born and then it gets routed from person to person, and as it does, it changes status, or maybe there's tasks that need to be completed, or an order that needs to be estimated and then, fulfilled and billed and paid and so on. And this entanglement, or this conflict, or this battle between storing data as a database and building a solution that facilitates a workflow really, I think, creates that tension, and it makes it harder for people to keep performance in mind. They're so busy thinking about the data they need to store and storing it in a sort of a normalized or structured or logical form. And they're also thinking about these workflows and processes that the user needs to go through, from how are the screens being presented, that the idea of this third piece of the puzzle, that you have to reconcile, which is how to make sure all this performs really well, is sort of the last thing you're going to think about. And so I think most of our solutions are both. And the goal here is to come up with the tools and methods and general understanding of the platform so that we can keep these things in mind. And just like rules of language or rules of the road, they become second nature over time. I mean, nobody knew how to drive a car on day one. You had to go to school, you had to practice, you had to learn your ABCs, you had to take a test, and eventually you got out there, and even in the beginning it was unfamiliar, and only over time did it become second nature, where you can almost do it while you're doing 10 other things. And so that's the goal here, is to kind of plant the seeds and get you the information you need so you can start to practice some of these habits. Maybe start with just a small set of them right off the bat, see how those impact your performance of your solutions, and then over time adopt more and more habits. What you'll basically be doing is creating a richer toolbox. So it's not just this dichotomy of database or workflow, but you can have both and they can perform well. So here's my solution, what I think is basically a 4-step process for getting you where you want to go. The first is identifying the problem. Like all good step programs, we need to admit the fact that we've got a problem, and the problem is that software requires optimization. All platforms do. We need to kind of figure out a way to understand and optimize our solutions. It's inevitable, especially as people go mobile, we start to host things in the cloud, that things we can't control, like the internet, or the latency and performance of a network that is distant as opposed to local and near us, is something we're going to have to grapple with. So we can't avoid that. That's the problem. We got to gather information. We have to kind of understand, what are the rules that govern how this stuff works? What are the things I can change? What are the things I cannot change? So I can change the things that I have control over. And then probably the hardest step of all is adopting new habits. We have to kind of come up with a mechanism for us to learn these new practices. You know, I know that one example I've given recently is, you know, we did a remodel and I had a light switch on the wall, and before we did the remodel, I knew where the light switch was. I could be walking into the room blindfolded. It didn't matter if there were any lights on. I always knew where the light switch was. I could find it every single time. We did the remodel and the light switch moved 3 inches to the left, and it took me a couple months to realize it was to the left and to re-ingrain that muscle memory that I could find the light switch where I needed it to be. So this is similar to that. We've got to find a way to not just gather the information and assimilate it, but then we also have to practice it and practice it and practice it. And obviously we don't have much time here to practice it. So that's why I want to give you a very small set of new things to adopt and learn. And then as time permits, maybe I'll demonstrate a couple of those, but mostly we're going to talk about them and point you to the resources that you need. And then you got to keep doing this. You have to keep your ears open, keep your eyes open, and follow the discussions and conversations about new techniques for performance or changes in the platform that impact performance, so that you can gather that new information and adopt new habits, change old habits to accommodate what's new. There's some really great new stuff I'm going to point out here that is for free. It just came with FileMaker 15 and is why I think many of us should just update yesterday. But some of it, there's nothing you can really do much other than just enjoy it. You can't game it or leverage it deliberately in some way. It's just there. But eventually someone might figure out certain situations where you can use it deliberately, or another change will come out in the platform that kind of usurps or overthrows the previous best practice and requires us to adopt a new habit of some kind. And we've seen this happen in every platform as well. What used to work one way is updated to work another way because that other way is more efficient or more effective for today's world. And the pace at which this stuff changes is going to get faster and faster too. We already know that FileMaker is releasing software on a more regular kind of annual basis. It used to take longer for us to get new releases, but we're seeing this in every platform. The new devices, new technologies, new platforms are coming out all the time, and the pace at which those are changing and disrupting the status quo is getting faster and faster. And so this is also about adopting the habit of gathering information and adopting habits. That's sort of called a meta habit. You have to kind of learn how to do that over and over so you can stay on top of this and keep things performing well. So we've done the first one. We've identified the problem. The problem is all software platforms have performance optimization demands. There's domain constraints. We've got to reconcile the form and function, and we need a mechanism for doing it. Now let's talk about gathering information. So let's first of all talk about the 5 top performance changes in FileMaker 15, all of which came with the platform built in, and many of you probably have this already available to you if you haven't yet deployed it. The first is the iOS Application Sdk. We'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. The portal inline progress bar, Truncate Table, script step, Topco Logging, which is a FileMaker server client statistics feature, and something called cache temp file persistence, which is the most technical thing I'm going to talk about today, and only passingly, I'm going to point you to a resource for those of you who really want to dig into it, but it's a great thing, and it's now available for both FileMaker Go and FileMaker Pro, and let's dig into each of these a little bit to help you understand them. So what is the iOS Application SDK? So I've quoted a couple of items right out of the FileMaker help here, just so I was clear about my attribution. It basically allows you to build standalone iOS apps from your FileMaker solution. So it's kind of like the old way we used to make runtimes, or maybe some of you still do, where you use the developer toolkit to do that. Basically, it lets you bundle up your application and put it on the device as if it was another icon right there on the home screen or one of your screens as an app. You don't even have to have FileMaker Go installed. It's sort of bundled all together there. The nice thing about that, of course, is from the user's perspective, it's really streamlined. For them, it just looks like an app. They don't have to understand that they need this thing called FileMaker Go, and then inside that they put this, file and all that kind of extra layer of complexity that maybe for some users is not relevant. There'll be other users who are going to completely understand that this is FileMaker Go for their iOS, just like they have FileMaker Pro for their laptop or desktop, and they're going to like that kind of flexibility. But for certain populations of users, just giving them an app is going to feel more natural to them. The other nice thing about it is that it allows the file structure to reside locally on the device. And by the file structure, I'm talking about things like the actual framework of the file, the layouts with all the different objects or graphics or images or descriptions of the different fields and colors and themes and such. And while that's still possible today in Go, the fact that you can bundle this up and deliver it right to the user and still maybe access data that's remotely stored on a server means that some portion of the data you otherwise would have sent across the network is actually already on the device. So there's no need for packets of data to kind of bring down the window dressing, so to speak, and kind of then render it. It can read that stuff right off the SSD drive on the device and start rendering it right away. And so it just kind of gives a boost to performance. So really what we're talking about is a little bit of performance optimization from the user experience in terms of the installation and launch of a custom app as opposed to this extra click to go into Go first. And then you have this other local benefit of having some of the data in the file in the form of the structure of the file, sort of the container that contains your actual information, and being stored locally so that it can perform better. The only real con I'd say at this point is that there's no automated way to update that. There's various techniques out there. I believe there's some sessions at this last summer's DevCon about updating applications, whether they're in Go or as an iOS Application Sdk application. Regardless, it's not sort of a one-click built-in kind of push a button and it happens kind of thing. And so that's probably the only criticism I'd say at this juncture, and I admit that's a bit of a stretch. The portal inline progress bar is the next new feature I want to talk about. And basically the information here is that when a portal on a layout is going to take more than a second to render and display the content, regardless of the parameters, it doesn't matter how many records are in there, whether there's sorting going on or filtering or whatever other things might be impacting the performance. If the solution determines it's going to take more than a second to do that, or it hits that limit, whatever the algorithm is, it's basically going to display a progress indicator while it allows the user to interact with other areas of the layout. So it used to be that you had to kind of wait for that and you'd get your beach ball or you'd get your little sand thing, and now you're not going to get that anymore. You're going to see this little indicator spinning and you're going to be able to go around and interact with other parts of the layout while those portals continue to load. So instantly you're just basically giving the user the option to work in parallel to a process that used to kind of stop them. So the pros is there's nothing for you to do to develop this. This just happens automatically. It's just built in as a new behavior in the way that portals render and allow other kinds of activity to take place. It leads to a smoother experience with those portals because they don't kind of stop the user, and the experience is better for the user. So it's just basically an overall better experience right out of the bat. Now there could be other reasons, underlying reasons, which I'll hint at here in a moment as to why your portals are taking so long to load, and that in and of itself could be a problem in other areas. But this kind of nips it in the bud in a little bit. It doesn't mean that when you go to scroll the portal or interact with the records in the portal that you at that point engage with some of these performance limitations because of the way the portal's been designed or the contents behind it are being displayed. You could still be loading lots of data and sorting lots of records, and it could take a long time for that inline progress bar to display, but at least you're able to do other things in the meantime. But I'd imagine users eventually would get kind of frustrated with the fact that this thing is still constantly kind of making them wait, even though they can do other things. Maybe they have nothing else they need to do. So the cons are it's not a solution. It doesn't solve your slow portal problems, and it's not something you really use deliberately. It's kind of almost by accident. It's used when it's necessary and it's helpful, but it isn't the kind of thing that I'd say you lean on. If anything, frequent exposure to this feature probably indicates an underlying problem in the way your portals and your relationships are configured in the first place. Truncate Table. In a similar fashion, but this is maybe the first, other than the iOS Application Sdk, this is like the real, one of the first deliberate, you can really do something with this. Basically, Truncate Table is a new script step that basically allows you to tell FileMaker or FileMaker Server to basically delete all the records in a table. And there's some parameters. Again, I've quoted these out of the FileMaker help. It deletes all records in the specified table, and it doesn't care about what the found set is in that table. It doesn't matter whether you're even in that context. You could be in the person table and say delete all companies. And it doesn't matter if the last time you were in the companies table, you had 5 companies found out of 10,000, it's going to delete all 10,000. In order for it to do that, of course, it has to lock the records. So there's a limitation there. If someone has one of those records open, even 1 out of 10,000, it's not going to be able to perform this function. It's going to throw an error. It also won't delete related records. So even if you have the relationship configured to do cascading deletes, it's not going to delete those cascading deletes. It's basically going to just ignore them. So obviously, there could be some limitations here. Just to say for the past, in the past, that record lock process required a significant number of round-trip communications between the client and the host. So whether it was peer-to-peer FileMaker or whether it was FileMaker Pro to FileMaker Server, there was a whole lot of chatter and activity that took place in order to get that lock on those records before that delete command could be issued, before that update process could take place. And this basically takes a good chunk of that communication out of it and just says, hey, just do it. Just try to get the lock and delete the data, please. And there's some trade-offs, of course. Obviously everything has to be deletable, and it didn't do cascading deletes because that could be pretty dangerous. Deleting all records, even the old way, using the script command or the menu command was dangerous. I know a lot of developers who remove that command by default using custom menus because it can trigger this cascade of lots of other deletes, which could not only take time, but maybe destroy unintentional data. So the pros, this is great for cleaning up temporary tables. If you're using virtual lists or doing some kind of data processing where you import data and chop it up and then put it where it belongs, and you've got this leftover record data, you can make the removal of that extra record data pretty quick by just saying truncate table and that data is gone. And you can use this in series. So if you do need a cascading delete, but you're not going to get it with truncate table, there's nothing to say you couldn't say truncate table A, truncate table B, and truncate table C, and one right after the other, they would be truncated and removed. As long as all the other conditions applied, you wouldn't need the cascading delete. Of course, here you're being deliberate then. You're saying, I deliberately want to delete this kind of cascading activity by doing several truncates in a row. Whereas if you use the delete all records command, or the user does delete all records in some way, scripted or otherwise, those cascading relationships kind of trigger automatically. And so the idea here, I think, is that you can be very surgical and precise in the way you do this, but you also have the risk of leaving orphans behind if you accidentally forget to delete the child records when you delete the parents. On the cons, it's really just the caveats, that you got to monitor and trap for the errors that could happen when it can't get a record lock. You run the risk of leaving orphans behind, the things I've already mentioned. So overall, great new feature to have, definitely has a benefit, but only in cases where you really do need to purge all the records in a table on a regular basis. Topco Logging is the second most complicated, and that's mostly because I'm not going to get into it in too much detail. I'm going to point you to a great resource that's freely available to the public at the end here that describes case by case how to use it with some very practical examples from the man who helped to build it. But let me kind of give you an overview of what it is and what it does. So basically, Topco Logging is a new client statistics feature that you enable deliberately on FileMaker Server. It writes the data for the Topco stats into a particular log. The path is there on the screen, along with all the other logs in the FileMaker Server logs folder. It captures the top 25 client requests, which took the longest time to complete. So basically, when this is turned on, basically it's monitoring and it's capturing with whatever interval setting you've got, what were the top 25 slowest requests to a client during that period. Now, there could have been, a lot of slow ones, maybe 50 or 100 out of a population of 1,000, but it's just going to show you the top 25 worst ones, which are probably the ones you're trying to troubleshoot. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. I think, because it's a little unclear, and I need to follow up on this, that it adheres to the same interval and log sizes as the other client statistics. One would assume it does, because I read through the help, and from what I gather, it doesn't specifically say that the top call log adheres to that. It calls out that fact for the other client statistics logs. I think that might just be a minor typo in the FileMaker help. I kind of hope it is, because I'm a typo fiend. But regardless, you can assume for now that it does, that if you set the interval to be every minute or every 5 minutes, that's the window during which it's going to pull out the top 25 from that period, and that when the log size reaches the limit, it's going to spit out a top call stats .log-old or some similar kind of naming convention, and then it's going to start a fresh one. And so it kind of follows the same patterns and behaviors of the other client statistics logs. There's a whole bunch of information about this in the advanced techniques section at the end of my session here, where I'll point you to those resources I mentioned. So don't worry about me only kind of glossing over the surface of it right now. So the pros, it gives you a real detailed analysis of those top 25 calls. It gives you all kinds of information about the table and the user and the kind of activity that was taking place, and therefore can allow you to decipher exactly what information was moving from where to where, so that you can do some troubleshooting more discreetly and precisely about where you need to solve things. The cons are it requires detailed analysis. So that's not simple stuff. It doesn't just say, hey, you've got a problem with the parent table. When Joe went to go do this list view, it downloaded 10,000 records. It's a bit more arcane than that. And so when you go look at the resources I'll point you at, you'll see that there's reference to internal structure IDs, the kinds of things you see in a database design report, like table ID or field ID. And as a result, there's a bit of deciphering that needs to be done in order to figure out which table that is or which file that might be. And that's done for security. Primarily, I believe, as well as probably just because that's the way the information is being kind of managed by FileMaker server, so they're not translating into something human readable as much as they're trying kind of keeping it in the form it is now and keeping it secure so that someone looking at it wouldn't know what exact information was moving in which file from which table and reveal details about the internal workings of your file. Table person is a lot different than table 22. And so keeping things anonymous like that. There is a sample file I know that was mentioned during the session at DevCon by John Thatcher, which I'll be referencing here in a minute, which pointed to a file that can map that stuff together for you. Can let you take the top call stats log, put it into the file, then take a database design report, put that into the file, and then it combines them and deciphers that information for you to make it more human readable. So I didn't include a link for that here, but I can make sure to point that it is out in John's slides, which are available, like I said, to the public. And the last is cache temp file persistence. Basically, this actually originally appeared in FileMaker Go 14. Now it's available also in FileMaker Pro and FileMaker Go 15. Basically what it's doing is instead of deleting the cache file is a local file on your computer that basically stores all the information that you've downloaded. So whether that's the bitmap of the table and all the records in it, whether that's the actual records you brought down that you consumed and used or looked at, whether it's the layouts and their design or the scripts that you ran or whatever it is that you pulled down, you notice probably as you use FileMaker, it gets faster as you use it because it's got more of the information you're working with stored and cached locally in the temp folder on the machine or the device that you're working on. Well, it used to be as soon as you closed out of the file, that cache file was gone. And so the next time you logged in, you had to start all over again. Well, what they've done now is they've made it so that in certain conditions for hosted solutions, when you connect, that cache file will persist. And there's various business rules that, determine how long it'll stick around and how much disk space is left on the machine and such, and at what point will it start over. But the thinking is, if we keep what we used last time stored in a safe and secure way here in a cache file on the machine, then when the user connects to the solution 2 days later or the next business day or after the weekend, we'll get kind of a speed boost because we can compare the current state of the file to the state of the information that they had. We can discard whatever they had that has changed. But if the file is more or less the same, I don't have to download the layouts again. And if a lot of the core data hasn't changed, then I don't have to download that again. But maybe some order statuses or new contact records got created. Well, when they need that information, I'll send that to them. And so effectively, it allows you to kind of get a leg up. It lets you kind of build on your previous activity with the solution. And if you use the solution every day, or every business day, like most of us use our FileMaker solutions, you're going to really see that launch times to get into your application each day are going to be quicker. And depending on the nature of your particular solution and how frequently you're developing in it or changing the data set in it, you might find that you get a dramatic speed boost because you really just have this tiny little bit of new data that's accumulating every day, but a lot of old stuff and old layouts and stuff that don't really change that often. And you can keep reusing that cache information and don't have to move it over the network. This is a huge boost to launch time. It can actually have a very dramatic performance impact on certain solutions that meet certain kind of usage or data collection parameters. It's just a smarter way to have cache managed. So the pros, nothing to develop, it just works. At least tries to keep stuff up to 15 days, and then, like I said, it manages some exceptions there around where it's hosted and whether or not you have enough disk space to allow it to stick around. I couldn't come up with a con of any kind. I didn't see anything in the implementation here that didn't just make sense and didn't seem smart. Tip of the hat to Clay Mackel and the the rest of the development team at FileMaker who implemented these changes, and I'll be pointing you to Clay's session, which also discusses this feature in detail and breaks down all those rules for you. So now let's talk about gathering information. So I'm not going to belabor a lot of these because there's a lot of information on the screen here. I'm just going to point out. So there's a lot of oldies but goodies. These are things that have been talked about for years in various Dev Concessions. And I will say that all of the slides from all of these sessions are also available now publicly because they've all been put up on my session from this last year's DevCon. So you can pull down all those slides and read about all these things. But basically, we talk about things like, what are the aspects of schema that impact performance? How do tables, joins, and dependencies impact performance? What about how records move or found sets get managed or the default found set for a particular context or layout that you're on? How about fields? What do we need to know about the number of fields we have in a table, or the type of fields, or how they're stored, or what kinds of things trigger this? I'm not talking about script triggers here. I'm talking about like what makes data move? What kinds of actions can you put a user through that will trigger an avalanche of data when you didn't mean it to, or even just a small bunch of data to move over the wire, which they don't even need because they're going to do something else. And some of my practical examples I'm going to give you are really based on this old stuff. But I could spend, several hours going through all this old stuff, and that's been done before in various webinars and various white papers, so I'm going to point you to that stuff instead. There's all kinds of information out there about the communication protocols, how do records get committed, what happens when they get pulled down, what happens when they get open, what happens when they get closed. Some of this builds off the records section as well. What's a round trip and notifications? Again, some of these things have been tuned and optimized, like the cache file stuff that we just talked about a moment ago. So some of the older information is now out of date and has been updated. Again, like I talked about earlier, that means we need to keep gathering information and adopting new habits. So what we learned about back in 2010 and 2009 about performance is dramatically different today. At the same time, a lot of the underlying basics are the same. I like to think of that as sort of like the alphabet hasn't really changed. We've got all these great emojis and emoticons and other kinds of interesting ways that we've kind of enriched our language, but we still have A through Z. And even though we're kind of creating new words all the time, the old words still are out there and apply. And for the most part, they're still valid. Maybe some words out there that we don't use that often anymore, like buggy and stuff like that. But there's still a bunch out there. And I mean, like car and buggy, that kind of thing. Obviously, software is still buggy sometimes. All right, finally, we have window dressing, the themes that actually kind of describe and define how our layouts look, the complexity of our layouts, maybe the scripting and interfaces in general, how we present information and what kinds of impact those things can have on performance. And then finally, last but not least, the technical infrastructure. What kind of hard drive or infrastructure do we have on the server? How many processors do we have? What kind of RAM and what kind of cache settings do we have on the server? Is it appropriately set for our type of solution? And just generally, how is the server configured and maintained? And are we using standby and other things to kind of optimize the uptime and availability of our databases? All this information can be found in a variety of places, such as Underhood session in 2009 from John Thatcher, my 2010 session, my 2011 session, my 2012 session, my 2013 session, all of which I should note, I'm just going to rattle through. These slides, like I said, are all available on one of the links I'm about to show you, and all of them cover in varying degrees of detail the foundational kind of when John taught us the alphabet in 2009, followed by my trying to kind of just echo that message and expand on it and make it tangible and real and do some testing and kind of help people understand that kind of what he was saying then and why it mattered to us and how you can game and use that information to achieve your goals for performance. There's been a couple of key white papers that have tried to encapsulate this in a text form. The first one was back in 2012. I wrote all three of these. I'll just tell you that right now. I wrote these, under commission with FileMaker, so they asked me to kind of try to take this body of information, much of which had nothing to do with me. It was stuff coming from FileMaker under the hood sessions or from the engineers, or was part of new features like explaining how themes worked, or it was taking it from the FileMaker training series and trying to distill it down for a broader audience. Whatever it was, I was just standing on the shoulders of giants trying to help amplify this message or distill it into kind of useful and practical techniques. So in 2012, we had one specifically around designing faster database solutions for iOS. We then built another one on iOS and performance in April of 2014. And then finally, I think what I would consider to be the largest body of work, the biggest of all of these documents, where I tried to cover the largest amount of material within a reasonable number of pages, was a design performance paper in September 2014. Again, I'll make sure that all these links are available to you in a PDF or a PowerPoint type presentation when I'm done. I think that this is really where you're going to find the bulk of the information about those oldies but goodies. This is where we're going to expand on them, give you practical examples of them, explain why they're important, and give you some quick tips on how you should start using them. There's pictures, there's images, there's a variety of kinds of good resources inside these 3 white papers. There's also lots of discussion on the FileMaker community about these white papers. I believe several of these white papers require you to be a member of the FileMaker community, which is free. Some of them may be available by just giving your email address to FileMaker for a free download. There have been a recent series on design related to deployment and design, and they kind of at times mention performance as well, so I don't want to slight those in any way. But I think these are going to be 3 seminal core papers, the last of which I think would be the one I would start with if you really just kind of want to catch up on the oldies but goodies and all the sort of information that's been out there for several years. In general, the 2016 Dev Concessions kind of really were a pivotal moment as well. There's certainly recorded content and other kinds of information that are only available to DevCon attendees. But something I've noticed recently and just tested was that, first of all, you can become a member of the FileMaker community. There's a lot of great resources and discussions up there, like I just mentioned a moment ago. There's no fee to sign up. There's all kinds of other options to, get trial software and pre-release and a development copy of FileMaker Server where you can sign up for additional services. But the community membership gives you access to a huge number of FileMaker developers, many with scores of years of experience and who are often willing to give significant amount of their time to answer questions and point people in the right direction. But interestingly, it seems that the sessions themselves and the materials, and I'm hoping I'm not undoing myself by putting this out there, they appear to be available to the public without signing up. So if you went to that link there, the community.filemaker.com community DevCon 2016 session materials, you'd actually see a list of all the sessions and the ability to click on a session and read the summary, which is very similar to what you might have seen on the schedule for DevCon, but also to download the slides and sometimes even sample files depending on the topic. And I created an easier link on Bitly so that you could kind of maybe find it a little easier. Again, I'll make sure that this is available to you. But if you go to my session there, which is one of the core sessions on designing for WAN performance, you will find not just the session I did this summer, which has some overlapping content with today, but also all those previous years going back to 2009 and the slides from those as well. And the goal there, I think, was to share this information. FileMaker wants everybody to build solutions that perform well. And they know, because it's so easy to use, that a lot of solutions get built informally, they become mission critical, and then they grow and they don't perform well. Or they started out locally and then they get hosted on the WAN, on the cloud, or some other way, or shared with remote users, and then they start to not perform well. And these, again, are not problems that can't be fixed. Maybe you need to just refactor your solution in some way. Maybe you need to replace the solution. There's a lot of different ways to skin that cat. It really comes down to understanding, before you dive right in, where are the bottlenecks, and more importantly, why are they happening, so that you can design a solution that will obviate those problems. And so I put those previous sessions out there hoping that they would agree with me that getting information out to the community is better than not. In particular, I want to point you to a series of sessions from this year that I think are specifically geared around performance. You'll notice that there's 3 under the hood sessions there in the middle that are coming directly from key product managers or engineers at FileMaker related to WebDirect, the database engine itself, which gets into the cache temp file persistence, and server performance, which gets into a really great review of Topco Logging and how to use it to decipher performance problems. John makes a really good point there, that you shouldn't just wade in with practical examples and just try to make things perform better purely on theory, because it may not solve the problem. If you can really identify where the problem is, you're more likely to be able to surgically go in and solve it. And I completely agree. That's not going to keep me from giving you some practical examples anyway, because I think learning the Topco logging feature may be overkill for some users, especially if you're just starting out building solutions. And I want you to kind of have some good habits to adopt in the beginning that will prevent some of the bottlenecks in the future, because they're good practices, I think, overall anyway, for a variety of reasons, not just performance perhaps. But I wouldn't by any means say you shouldn't review John's material. I read through it myself. I went through the logic of his deductions and how he took that information and was able to decipher where the problem was. Of course, he, along the way, just like Clay, introduces all kinds of information in detail about why data moves that way and kind of reinforces those oldies but goodies, the kind of information about how FileMaker really works that has been true for quite a while and hasn't changed that much. And as a result, he can kind of connect the dots between the old and the new to show how this tool kind of gives you a way to have insight into really what's going on, connect the dots. And for some of us, that's what it takes to get the light bulb to go off. So let's talk about the practical examples. Of course, I had to pick my favorites. I like to always include my family in here some way. You can guess who my favorite is in that group. It's Sally. I can't pick favorites, actually, though. I love them all. But here's my 4 favorites. Using themes, managing your found set, planning for narrow tables, and leveraging the server. I think if you can get these 4 things kind of understood, you're going to be much better off in terms of how your solutions perform in general, and you'll probably have more discrete things to troubleshoot when it comes to bottlenecks. So using themes, there's a lot that's been said about this. It's in the design performance paper. There's various overviews and introductions to themes and why they're good and how to use them in FileMaker and the FileMaker help. DB Services, a member here of FM Academy, came up with a couple of really great posts about WebDirect and best practices for themes that, again, reinforce the message. So I'd recommend you go look at our partner and see their blog about that information. And again, all of these are links. But in a nutshell, themes use CSS, not necessarily the current version that's out there in the wild on the web, but a relatively modern version that does this very same thing. It's a more efficient way to store the descriptive information about how your pages should be rendered, which means it's a smaller download because it's just instructions. It's not literally piece by piece, object by object, detailed information about each piece. So it's faster for the engine to render because it doesn't have to kind of figure it out for every individual object. It can just say render a field and use the CSS, which I already have loaded into memory and know how to do. It's easier to develop because you don't have to constantly be chasing around slight modifications and changes. You can just say, oh, I need to change the button from red to a darker kind of red, and you can change the theme, and everywhere in your solution it updates, and it sort of doesn't matter where you are. If all the layouts are using that theme, they'll all update instantaneously. And for the user, it's a more consistent and uniform design experience. So it creates less friction for the users, which means it improves user performance. Managing your found set is my next favorite one. The thinking here is that I don't like people to have to hunt for their data. And right now, I think the regime we're used to is, bring them to open them up to the list view and show them all the records. And odds are the top record is the oldest record in the database, and I don't need that record anymore. Or it's like my first client, and maybe I'm 20 years old as a company, and my most recent clients are at the bottom of the list. So I kind of feel like this is giving people a haystack when they want a needle. So I recommend that you start empty-handed, meaning at a minimum, open your solution to an empty table. And there's another good reason for that John points out in his session from this last summer, which is that the bitmap of the records in that table is effectively empty, and that's small. And if you had a 1,000,000 record table, even if you had nothing on the layout and you just opened it to a blank layout, there's still that very large bitmap, which could be 1,000,000 bits or 1,000 bits or however many records worth of bits. And that can add up to a non-trivial chunk of data that has to move across the wire just to kind of open the solution. So at a minimum, you should start empty-handed. I also like the idea that as you're moving around, if you can move to, to empty tables, or you can move to layouts with nothing on them, there's all kinds of other benefits, and those are detailed in some of those white papers. I want you to also think about the default order of your script steps. And this is more for the folks who've been around for a while using FileMaker, but it's also something about kind of the way we think about the way we move places. Like when I'm looking for my keys, I go to the kitchen and then I start looking for my keys. And back in the day, when we were doing scripts in FileMaker, we would say, I'm in the company table, I want to find a person. So what would I do? I would go to the person section of the database. So I click on the person button, or I'd choose the person layout, and then I'd go to find mode. And what we learn about, and it's detailed in this white papers, is when you do that, you load data that you don't necessarily intend to where you went. It's like I go to the kitchen and I see the whole kitchen, which is a lot more visual information than I need because I'm only looking for my keys. So the same is true in the database. If I go to my layout and then enter find mode, I loaded whatever records might have been in that layout when I first loaded it before I went to find mode so I could find something else. If we can switch that around and go into find mode before I go to the layout, sort of like get ready to be only looking for my keys before I even walk into the kitchen, then I'm gonna not load any data that I don't need. I have to load the layout because that's where I'm doing my finding, but I don't have to load the records that were there because I didn't want them anyway. So this is just sort of a switch. It's literally thinking in a way that's completely unnatural to us, because those of us who built solutions 20 years ago were always go to layout, enter, find, go to layout, enter, find, and now I'm asking you to do it the other way. And there's probably a lot of other scripts out there than just this one example where that default order or that natural kind of order you're thinking of it needs to be turned on its head to make sure you don't accidentally spill data. And again, knowing those rules and basics of the road is really going to help you understand where those opportunities may lie. And then really, I think the biggest opportunity, and probably worthy of a couple of its own sessions, is this idea of orchestrating the user experience. If you can give users records that matter to the task that they're doing, or to that user, like show me my customers, or show me my open tasks, or show me just the next task I need to do. I got actually a request from a new customer today that said, I need a list of steps, but I only want to show my user the next step. I don't even want them to know that there's 20 more coming, because when they're done with that one, then they need to know about the other one. The nature of their business is they're not thinking downstream, they're thinking right now, and they don't want people distracted. They want the next one queued up, but they don't want the user to have to deal with it. Well, that's a great example of this. They're doing a process that is task-oriented. They need to have one task at a time. Give them one task at a time. It's lean. It just gives them what they need. It only loads that record data to the user. It declutters the interface so they're not scrolling. They won't accidentally choose the wrong thing. There's all kinds of frictionless or de-frictioning kind of activity there that are really worth doing. You might think of it as more like recent history, like show them the last 5 records they worked with or the most recently, managed orders or something. Because again, even if these aren't theirs or assigned to them, they're probably the information they're looking for. And a lot of this is going to be driven by use case, right? It's going to be driven by what your particular solution does and how your users work. But keep in mind that the way your users work is often governed by the way you design your solution to optimize how they work. So a lot of times we build solutions around the status quo. Here's how I do it now, and I do it with paper, so let's build an electronic version of that. But there's a huge opportunity there to say, well, that's the way you do it now, and we could build an electronic version of that, but that's not going to be optimal from a performance standpoint. Instead, what I'd like to do is change it. What if we just thought about it differently? What if we just gave you the orders you worked on yesterday, because most of the time those are the payments that you're processing today, or whatever the particular scenario might be. And the other is to think about finding and filtering things versus browsing and sorting. Browsing and sorting is an incredibly expensive way to move through your data in your database, period. If you're browsing a large number of records or you're sorting a large number of records to find the record you want, sort my most recent sales to the top or sort my customer list alphabetically so I can scroll down to the one that I want to see. You just loaded tons of data that's off screen and you may not even need. But if I can change that paradigm to find the records I want or filter to find the product I want, as opposed to showing me them all, and you could even combine these, like don't start with all and then filter it down, start with none and filter it up. And so the various techniques out there for using script triggers to allow for type ahead, which can then trigger some kind of refresh on a list view or a portal, these are the kinds of mechanisms. But in order to really make those work well, you kind of have to be trapping for and managing the found set along the way to make sure that you're not falling into the default. If you think about it, when I go into a list view and I do a find and I don't find what I want, the default behavior for FileMaker is to show me the last found set. Now, the last found set is going to be all the records if I just opened up the file, which means I just got at least 25 or more records that I don't want to get. So if I can script that so that it doesn't show me the found set that was there before, but shows me nothing, trap the error and suppress it, manage that process, then I can make sure that I only send users what they need and never send them just junk. I mean, I almost kind of wish, like when I searched for Google or I searched for Amazon and I was doing a really precise search, that the end result was if I didn't find anything, it just said nothing found that matches your criteria. I know that that doesn't make sense because often you find nice things because it's smarter than that, but it's that kind of feeling, like let them find what they want and be sure that if you're showing them things that they don't want, that that's the right outcome, that that's helpful to them and not just an accident of lazier development. Planning for narrow tables. So this is a really deep topic, and the basic idea here is, I talked about this in 2015, I believe, when I did a topic just on one-to-one relationships. The idea here is that, narrow tables isn't necessarily all about one-to-one relationships. Narrow tables means tables which have fewer fields, because the larger a table is, the more data that FileMaker has to move. If you have 150 or 200 fields in a table, even if a bunch of them are unstored calculations or containers or other kinds of fields that don't load, but you still got a large body of date and time and text fields, those move as a set. That's one of those fundamental oldies but goodies and sort of the rules of the road. Well, narrower tables means you can be a little bit more discrete. and just mete out to the user these 5 fields or those 4 fields, or kind of more discreetly give them what they want. And so I talked about why one-to-one relationships are good in this session. I'll make sure that I share this as well. I think it might already be up there, but if it's not, I'll make sure it's included in that link for the DevCon materials from this year. And I talk about all the different ways that you kind of have to grapple with that and all the different kinds of examples or scenarios where one-to-one can be useful. Narrower tables is a great way to, a particular example of how you might use them. The way I like to explain to people is when I would employ narrow tables is to divide your tables along what I consider to be natural lines. You know, sort of demarks that seem to make sense. And so a couple examples are, what are the fields you might show to someone in a table view or a list view, I should say, that's probably a typo. So for example, let's say I go to my company list and I want to see, you know, the name of the company, the address, the rep who's assigned to the company, and their zip code, maybe their main phone number. Well, this information would be in the list view, but of course, there's lots of other information. There's address data, there's maybe notes, there's maybe the primary contacts, you know, there's maybe a map or a picture or a logo, who knows? There's kind of a URL and so on. Well, right now, if you just had one table with the company fields, let's say it's 100 fields. Well, even though I'm in the list view looking at 5 of them, I'm getting all 100 fields loaded down to my client. But if I was to create a table with just those 5 fields, and create another table with the other 95 fields, just to be extreme, and join them as a one-to-one, when I go to my list view, I'd have a very lean experience. It would load just 5 fields for each of the records in my list view, which is much leaner than 100 fields for each of the records in my list view. And what's even better is when I go to my form view and look at the record I just clicked on in my list view, I'd probably be only loading that one record. Depending on how I navigate between list and form, I could control just loading 95 fields for that one record as opposed to 95 fields for all the others. So if I can do that kind of natural split over table or list view versus form view, I get a better control over that. Another example is small versus large fields. So perhaps you have a bunch of different text and date fields related to contracts or manuscripts or whatever, and there's 1 or 2 fields that are particularly bulky. These are text fields where you've got a big chunk of text in there. Maybe it's a bunch of notes or comments. Maybe it's the body of a contract or a manuscript or an agreement or a chapter or whatever, but it's big. You know, I'm thinking about like an art database we built for a client where they had the provenance information, all the kind of history of who had owned this item in the past. And they didn't want it to be just in related records. They wanted it to be in a text field where they could control the formatting for printing and such. Well, in that case, that was a pretty large and bulky field, but it was only needed in certain instances. So by hanging that one large field into a one-to-one table off the main other record data, I was able to control when I revealed that to the user and when it loaded. So it wasn't just hiding the field behind a tab, because that doesn't really prevent it from loading. It was hiding it behind a tab and putting it in another table so that when I did reveal it, I only loaded that one large field for that one record I was on. I didn't bring around all this large text for the ride all the time. I'm thinking about the example here is I had this big bulky bike rack on the back of my wife's Suburban, and we didn't use it that often. And she looked at me and she's like, "Can you take that off? It's just like it's in the way. It causes my rear camera to beep at me all the time." Like, it was extra payload that we were carrying around, and it was creating a user experience for her that was bad. It was probably reducing our gas mileage and so on. And by removing it, to be selective about when I included it, I improved performance. And then the last would be field sets. You might have, like, you know, an order of some kind, or maybe a product description of some kind, and there are some natural groupings to fields. These are the fields about pricing. These are the fields around product description. These are the fields about product branding, or, you know, positioning, or customer information, you know, that might be facing them versus supplier information. These kinds of natural groups of fields might also be good candidates for putting into separate tables and chaining together, or maybe creating like a series of spokes around a hub where the main product information is. And by using one-to-one relationships there, I have the ability, again, to control how I parcel that information out to the user when they reveal it, what gets loaded, how much gets loaded, how many records are affected at one time. And last, we have leverage the server. Again, really deep topic. The best I can say at this point is if you learn the fundamentals of how FileMaker server schedules work, where you can run scripts or script sequences in a FileMaker solution on a scheduled basis, or the perform script on server script step, which basically allows you to hand off a script so it can be completed by FileMaker server. That means you have to understand which script steps are server compatible and which ones aren't. The most of them are, but some of them aren't. It's good to understand caching and indexing and why you would even bother, because the only reason to use perform script on server is if you really understand that FileMaker server's got better, closer proximity to caching and indexing, which means importing and manipulating data is something you can do much faster because there's no network overhead. If you don't believe that and understand it, it might be hard for you to want to take on the learning part of this curve. And then as a little one, it's useful sometimes to be able to say to the server, hey, I've got this found set of records. I need you to manipulate that found set of records, and to know the different techniques available out there to say, hey, server, here's my found set, or here are the criteria I use to arrive at my found set. Please use the same criteria so that you can find the same set of records and do the work for me. If you get these fundamentals down, you can then mix and match them in various ways to allow you to really take advantage of what Perform Script on Server can do. As you saw before when I looked at the Dev Concessions, there were a couple of really great sessions on specifically leveraging Perform Script on Server. There's a number of great blogs and other resources out there, as well as help in FileMaker website to kind of point you to how to use that and what are some of the opportunities and examples of where it can be good. It's a really big opportunity, especially if you're moving large data around or want to manipulate large sets of data, to let the FileMaker server do that work for you and then let you know when it's done, or maybe just do the work for you and not even bother. It'll just finish it in the background while you move on. But it's a really great opportunity. And it's just these four things: themes, managing your found set, using narrow tables, and leveraging the server, that I think are the four I would start with, because I think they're the four that are going to give you some of the biggest immediate bang for your buck that's tangible and noticeable and will prevent some downstream issues for you later. So we're going to talk now about advanced techniques in managing what you measure. There's a couple different ways that you can manage what you measure, probably several more, but the two that I'm most familiar with. One is using a tool like Wireshark. Another is using a tool like Topco Logging, which is built into FileMaker server. So this is just to make sure you're awake, because we're almost at the end here. I'm not talking about this kind of Wireshark. I'm talking about this kind of Wireshark. Wireshark is an open source packet filter. Basically, it's software that runs on Mac or Windows. They probably have a Unix version, but at this point, we're worried about Mac and Windows. And it lets you basically put this either at the client or at the server and isolate and capture traffic by a particular port number. So you can say, hey, watch for 5003, which is the port FileMaker server talks to FileMaker Pro and FileMaker Go, and capture activity for this interval, and then let me look at how much data went which way, up or down between the two devices. So the pros is it's great if you're doing isolated testing. If you're in a lab or on your local device, or maybe just you and your FileMaker server that you're developing on, you can use these to test whether or not, what's my baseline performance if I do the following actions, and then if I make these tweaks, what's my baseline performance now? And as a result, I can compare those captures and see whether or not I've actually made things better. The cons, it can be a bit complex to learn it at first. It requires you to analyze the dumped data, so you have to have a tool for that. I think I've got a really old tool that I'm more than happy to make available from 2010, which I use to help me kind of learn the basics of it. And it doesn't really tell you what it's moving or why. It just tells you how much data moved between this Pro and server or Go and server. It doesn't tell you necessarily what was moving or why it was moving. It's kind of indiscriminate. It's all bundled together. Here's how much stuff moved down that road, and here's how much stuff moved back that road the other way, and it doesn't peer into the individual boxcars and say what's inside them. A better option then might be to look into Topco Logging. This is smart logging of detailed client statistics like I detailed before. I'd point you again to that under the hood server performance session by John, where he really walks you through. It's great for catching the slowest stuff, even if it's not reported by the user, and that's important because the user may not be noticing things that are slow, but Topco Logging will, in which case you can make underlying performance improvements that no one's even complained about yet. The cons is, again, it's a bit complex to learn at first. It requires you to analyze the dump data, and you really can't control what's top. Like, you can control what the interval is, but unless you're controlling who's in the system and when and can reproduce the problem behavior, it's a bit like, kind of putting a filter out there and watching. You just get a lot more detailed information out. So you have to kind of, in both of these cases, use these tools more discreetly to identify what you want to look at and when. So wrapping up, I just want to point you again to, if you're in these various locations, Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Indiana, Missouri, Connecticut, Boston, or any place not mentioned above, by all means, please reach out to the FileMaker Academy member who is in your area or who introduced you to come to this webinar. All of us are also listed at the FM Academy website. Here's our basic contact information, FileMakerAcademy.com. And our next webinar is on October 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to be presented by AppWorks about their FM log tool, and basically it's going to be all about why you should add simple logging to your FileMaker app and how easy it can be. And they've got an example of a tool that they can use to illustrate how quickly you can do it and all the great value and benefits you get having logging on your solutions. So I know I'm at the end of my time here and I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I'm more than happy to hang out for a few minutes and answer questions. I'm going to switch over now to the control panel and see if we have any questions that I can answer here. And otherwise, thanks for coming. I hope this was useful and informative. The recording will be made available. That's one of the questions. Can I have the recording? Both this recording as well as the source material for the links and such inside my presentation will all be made available. Usually that's done within a couple business days, if not sooner. We just got to wait for the recording to convert from Gotowebinar, and then we'll be sure to post it quickly. I have a question here about one-to-one relationships. The person's saying basically when I have one-to-one relationships, it makes it difficult to duplicate a record and its child records and grandchildren. You're absolutely right. It's easy to delete because you can turn on cascading deletes. But if you want to do duplicate record, you actually have to create a script that's smart enough to basically go out and isolate each of the records that are part of this chain or this hub and spoke. And then each of those have to be duplicated and linked back together. So you're absolutely right. It does create difficulty. There's going to be certain situations where, maybe duplicating a record isn't a normal process in your solution, and therefore it's a non-issue. Maybe it's a matter of just creating a duplicate record script that's smart enough to kind of operate in those particular environments. So there is a solution there, but you're right. You'd have to override the duplicate record command with a script that could be smart enough to do that. So that's where you'd use custom menus to basically say, hey, take the duplicate record command and map it to a script which is smart enough to take that action for you. Sounds like someone else found another typo. Thank you very much. Kudos to Lucy for catching that one. So someone asked about the whole cache implementation and whether there's a negative side to that from a security perspective. From my understanding, and I would want to defer to Clay's slides for this, the cache is encrypted or secured based on the encryption and security protocols implemented inside the file itself. So if your solution is set to be encrypted, that cache data is encrypted. If the solution is not set to be encrypted, the cache data is not encrypted. Now, that's not to say that it's in plain text either. It is still a temp file that's stored in a temp folder. It is still stored in a format that if you opened it up with a text editor would be unreadable effectively by a human. There may be some technique I'm unaware of where a hacker could, if they could get to your physical machine and they could get to that temp file and they could find the right one and they could open it up and they might be able to decipher it in some way to extract some of that data. And assuming that if it was in there and it was readable and understandable, however it's been structured by FileMaker, there is a minor, security possibility there if they can physically get to the cache file. On the flip side, however, if your solutions are encrypted and secured, then the cache files inherit those settings. It's also worth noting that for local files, this cache file persistence is irrelevant. Those still disappear right away. It's only for hosted solutions. The reason being that there's really no significant benefit to keeping the cache file in a local file since the file is local anyway. Rosemary, thank you, from FileMaker, was listening and chimed in and said, I'm correct. The Topco log does follow the same interval and stats as the client stats. I'll be sure to send a follow-up to FileMaker to see if I just misread the help, but there may be a typo in there. Now it's a race to see who can get to fix the typo soonest. And I think that's everything else seems to be early sound checks. All right, so I'm going to end the recording now. Thanks again for attending. Keep your eyes posted to FileMakerAcademy.com for the recording, which we should have up there shortly. And I'll make sure we also include a link to the PDF of the session so that you can get all the links out of the content as well. Thanks again, everybody.